Hello, welcome to another episode of Academia Podcast. My name is Todd Thielen, and I am the host of the show, brought to you by us at Warp Zone U, at the Warp Zone Studios. And it is not live, but I will be pursuing live the more we move forward, but here in Hutchinson, Minnesota. Thank you for tuning in. It has been quite an interesting year so far. I've actually been looking forward to it. I've been setting forth some goals and some vision for the year. And if you're interested in hearing more about what that vision is, you can tune into our other podcast that outlines the 2021 battle plan. And so I'm just interested excited because things are starting to take some shape, starting to get a better routine as habits are starting to form once again. And just kind of in a nutshell, the basic philosophy of what I'm doing in terms of the 2021 battle plan is I'm trying to highlight some of the areas of my life and trying to really think about what I was doing in those times in my life when I was already succeeding in those areas. Maybe it was something in terms of like the early 2000s. I was probably at the top of my game, physically speaking. So what was I doing then, and what could I be doing now? Or maybe in 2014 it was a great year financially. I just had discipline. What was I doing in those years? So I'm kind of outlining some of those things and how to create some balance and how to create the priority level in every area of my life with the extra emphasis of having accountability. Alright, so kind of moving forward with the actual topic of this podcast in academia. One of the goals that I do have over the course of this 52 weeks is to read not just a book a week, but to read 52 books a year, which is different. Some are going to be shorter books, some longer. So I just got done with this book. It's The Law by Bastiat. And basically, I'll kind of go over some of the stuff that I felt like I learned from that. I decided to order my books from shortest to longest to kind of increase my level of reading every day in terms of pages read. I'm not sure if that was a good idea. This is a very thick and dense book. It is difficult to read. But in order to be able to comprehend the things that Bastiat is talking about in terms of the law, takes a little bit more supplemental reading and some looking at some history to be able to understand what's happening. But just to kind of outline the preview of the show here today, I'm going to be talking a little bit about this book, the Bastiat political philosophy here of the law, maybe some historical context so we can interpret it of how some of those contents relate to today. And I'm also going to talk about a little of the state of the public education system here in the U.S., especially Minnesota, some of my audience members here in Alaska, and just to kind of figure out maybe what is a good primer for how we should view public education for our children. Maybe it's our niece and nephews, maybe if we plan to have kids someday, or maybe you are a teacher, or maybe you just want to see what your role is in terms of education, or maybe even a larger scope of the state's involvement with our everyday life. Because I don't know about you, 2020 was an awakening year for just the level of the intrusion that the state has adopted in our lives. I mean, they were already there in our lives. When you see that level of involvement of the government in your life every day over every activity, then they are a leviathan that needs to be decapitated. And it's going to take education, because the education sector is a monopoly backed by the teachers' unions, federal governments, and everybody seems to think along the lines of if you're against public education, then you're against education. And that's simply not true. I'm going to be going into some of that here today, and I just want to thank you for tuning in. If you want to, you can find this online for free, PDF, or else if you want to, you can listen to an audiobook on YouTube, The Law by Bastiat. It's about a 2-hour audiobook. So, and once again, it's very dense and very thick, but if you can get through it, I guarantee you're going to read one of the most important essays in the 19th century regarding kind of a foreshadow of what's going to happen if we don't get this under control. So kind of going into the first part, the background and the context of Bastiat. Once again, he was a French author. He died when he was 49 years old of tuberculosis, and basically he wrote this the last year that he was alive. I kind of want to explain some things before we move on. He was a Frenchman. He lived in France. It was actually one of the largest global powers of the time. They had saw developments in the French Revolution decades before this. So the largest global powers in the world were Britain, they were Russia, they were France, they were Prussia, and Austria. Before this, the Ottoman Empire was certainly huge, but they were weakening. They were losing control. The U.S. was actually growing rapidly, and throughout the writing of this book, Bastiat applauds the U.S. in many areas, especially in the outlining of their Declaration of Independence. He was definitely a student of John Locke in the writing of the political philosophies that shaped the American Revolution. I know there are many people, and I've done some reading over the last year or so with current events, people that are not happy with the political philosophies behind the founding of America, believe them to be antiquated, outdated, and you see them doing foolish things such as getting rid of statues, renaming forts across the U.S., and trying to frame everyone as a racist, and thinking that things such as the Electoral College need to be outdone with, trying to welcome in new areas of socialism and communism into our country, and I'm going to explain how that is all happening. But taking a look into our history just a little bit is kind of an emphasis on why I choose to do some of these things. I don't just want to do a drive-by of current events. I believe that if you want to, you could find so much of that on social media in endless echo chambers of people just regurgitating talking points, information. We all know that an election happened. We all know that there's going to be, or there may not be, a new president. But basically speaking, the things that we're talking about have a greater picture as we zoom out a little bit of where we're at, because this conversation's been happening, and I'm going to be talking about how this sort of thing's been going on for at least 170 years. I mean, this book was written 170 years ago, and he was talking about some warnings of things that could possibly happen. Because one thing that he saw, and he definitely applauded the U.S., was that they were the front runners in this freedom movement, this liberty movement for a long time. But there were certain things that they were not doing that led them away from some of the intentions that they had from the beginning of the writings of the Declaration and the Constitution. So it was kind of a warning call, but it was also kind of one of the largest classical writings that we see since the Declaration, or since the Constitution, that it came out with a defense of people's liberty, mostly speaking life, liberty, and property. So basically what was going on in the world, the U.S. just defeated Mexico in 1848 during the writing of this book. The U.S. was avoiding international entanglements, but slavery was a growing concern internationally, and it brought more and more division, especially what was going on in the U.S. There was a border dispute going on between Britain and Maine, in which most land was awarded to the U.S., but with the exception of giving Canada a warmer water port. Britain was continuing its developments in colonialism. France continued its empire's expansion in Asia and North Africa. Russia continued its expansion, going south toward Prussia and east toward Siberia. The Ottoman Empire, once again, I was stating that they were beginning to weaken and losing control of the Balkans, which was, and also the new states of Greece and Serbia. So new states in Greece and Serbia were starting to weaken and losing control of the Ottoman Empire. They essentially went broke. And basically the ones that they were financing their empire to was Britain. And basically they just got so weak and so in debt that their empire imploded. It's kind of similar to what happened to the Roman Empire. Belgium broke from the Netherlands, and this is kind of an important development. They became an independent kingdom of Belgium. They signed in 1839 the Treaty of London, And basically all the great powers that I just explained to you all agreed that there would be neutral toward Belgium. But later on, decades down the road, that was disregarded by Germany in 1914, which led to Britain's declaration of war, eventually leading to World War I. There was a term of plunder, and I'm going to be getting more in depth what plunder means. It kind of just means legalized theft, not using the extra measures of outside of law to steal, but basically using the law to make sure that theft was legislated. Britain led to a tariff on food imports. They lifted the food imports, which were called the Corn Laws, and they made free trade a national policy into the 20th century. So they were kind of leading the way in some aspects to some free market principles in the later 1800s. There was a rise in Manchester-style school interest over protectionist agricultural interests. So basically there was one group kind of using legislative means to kind of overpower another group, that being school interest, and we'll get into that, and over agricultural interests using the law. The U.S. was actually in a period where they were before the Civil War. I would be interesting to see what Bastiat's take was and would have been on some of the commentary on the Civil War, as he basically died about 10-15 years before the Civil War. So that was huge issues going on in the U.S. This was right before the Civil War, his writing. And then there were liberal revolutions made around the 1830s all the way to 1850. And what I mean by liberalism at this time meant the replacement of autocratic governments by constitutional states under a new rule of law. It's basically a welcoming of democracy. Basically, there was more modernism in the schools being taught, more of an approach to the scientific method. There was start of a walk away of fundamentalism and the teaching of Christianity in schools. There was an emphasis being steered away from the family and the churches, the local sector, as where schools were becoming more of a center, as well as the post office. So we're starting to see liberal revolutions being taken place, especially in Britain, in France, and in Greece. Germany and Italy, they were actually under the control of several other governments, and they actually wanted a national government to unite under. So there was a huge ploy to nationalism. A lot of nations, especially in Europe, wanted to revolutionize a lot of things that they did. And a lot of this was kind of centered around pre-socialist movements and the pre-use of plunder in order to gain more funding to actually have a budget for their government, as they were trying to overthrow more monarchy type rule, but also to still institute systems of oppression through the use of democracy and through electors. We'll get into more of that a little bit later. 1848, attempt to overthrow monarchies, kind of went over that already. So I'm going to go through just a little bit of this, just some quotes that I found helpful in the law by Frederic Bastiat, as it kind of explains some things going on today. I felt like this one's kind of more COVID related. It kind of reminds me of kind of South Dakota's approach to everything. Basically, it says we should know it only by the inestimable blessing of safety, meaning that there's everything kind of going under this illusion of safety. It may be further affirmed that thanks to the non-intervention of the state in private affairs, our wants and their satisfactions would have developed themselves in their natural order. Basically speaking, is that South Dakota is trying to lead more instead of by mandate, more by influence. I remember going to a pancake restaurant, and they still had sanitation stations. They still had stations where you could check your temperature. You could see if there were any outbreaks in terms of temperature by other guests. And I thought it was a really cool kind of development that private businesses were taking their own measures instead of needing the force of the government hand. And that's kind of a central tenet of Bastiat, in the law is that he believes that the many of his contemporary political philosophers of the time meant that government was a necessary good in keeping justice, whereas Bastiat believed that government was an unnecessary evil that was there to pervert justice, and the basics of the law was meant to do away with injustice. It wasn't meant to preserve and keep justice, as he had believed that justice wasn't a form of natural order, but believed that the law was initiated to a basic terms of justification to allow yourself your own defense, which we see in our Second Amendment. It gives us justification to have private security, to keep and bear arms for yourself, to justify your own form of self-defense, and that would be in the means of outdoing any type of injustice. And to break it down very simply, any type of injustice would be hurting anybody or taking their stuff. And this book seems to be more about the taking of stuff through legal plunder. That meaning if anybody is depriving you your natural right of life, liberty, or property. And Bastiat goes further into explaining that personality is one of those as well, of those being the main four faculties of liberty. If anyone is depriving you of those four, then you have the right to your own form of self-defense, and that meaning that you are doing away with any type of injustice. But once again, his political contemporaries, philosophers at the time, had believed that government was a necessary good to do, not to do away with injustice, but to keep justice on their own. And Bastiat had gone to develop his understanding and thinking that the means of government can't do anything without the forms of force to back up what it is that they want to do, and to use plunder in order, because they can't produce anything on their own. So they have to use plunder, they have to use force. And if there is any type of law that seems to go against your own morality, then you're left with your own form of disillusionment as to which you're going to back. What you morally hold is true, what you ethically hold is true, as outlined by the law. So that's kind of his self in a nutshell. He kind of goes along to say that there is an inevitability of welfare. Basically, he said that labor being in itself is a pain, and man being naturally inclined to avoid pain, it follows, and history proves it, that whenever plunder is less burdensome than labor, it prevails. And neither religion nor morality can, in this case, prevent it from plundering. So then we say, well, where does welfare end? When does the plunder cease then? When it becomes more burdensome and more dangerous than labor. And that's why I'm kind of predicting, as the year kind of goes on, I think we're going to see more cases of unemployment fraud, especially with the $600 bonus over the last year, because it is more burdensome to carry on through a job, I believe, with following COVID restrictions, than it is to just sit at home and rack unemployment. It is until that becomes more burdensome, I don't believe that the welfare is going to go down, especially in terms of unemployment. So basically, I kind of already went along and said this, that about law and morality. When law and morality are in contradiction to each other, the citizen finds himself in a cruel alternative of either losing his moral sense or of losing his respect for the law, the two evils of equal magnitude being which it would be difficult to choose. Let's see here. He actually kind of talked a little bit about voting integrity, which is kind of weird because we're going through this right now. And I'll just kind of read what he had to say. Why is incapacity a reason for exclusion? Because the elector does not reap alone the responsibility of his vote. Because every vote engages and affects the community at large. Because the community has a right to demand some assurances as regards the acts upon which its well-being and existence depend. So he was kind of talking about, even back then, about why there needs to be voter integrity and why there needs to be why there's issues with voter fraud is development of democratic states and choosing electors and having elections was even in the 1850s becoming more of a developing topic. I'm going to kind of flip forward. I thought most of the stuff that was really good was kind of toward the end. This relates to education. It says that what sort of liberty should be allowed to men? Liberty of conscience, but we should see them all profiting by the same permission to become atheists. Liberty of education, but parents would be paying professors to teach their sons immorality and error. Besides, if we are to believe Mr. Thier's education, if left to the national liberty, would cease to be national, and we should be educating our children in the ideas of the Turks or the Hindus, instead of which, thanks to legal despotism of the universities, they have the good fortune to be educated in the noble ideas of the Romans, liberty or labor. But this only competition, whose effect is to leave all products unconsumed, to exterminate the people and to ruin the tradesmen. So basically, he's kind of going over some different ideas of what is awarded on one end and what is punished on another end if we see things develop, and we certainly are. Let's see here. Contradiction in ideas is unhappy to be found also in facts. Whilst the French nation has proceeded, all this has by no means prevented it from being more governed and directed and imposed upon and fettered and cheated than any other nation. So basically, he was talking about universal suffrage again, and the problems with that being voting. Let's see here. All right. Let's see here, talking about government. Have the people ever been known to rise against the Court of Appeals or assail the justices of the peace for the sake of claiming the rate of wages, free credit, tools of labor, the advantages of the tariff, or the social workshop? They know perfectly well that these matters are beyond the jurisdiction of the justice of the peace, and they would soon learn they are not within the jurisdiction of the law quite as much. So we're seeing this even now, that there's certain types of bureaucrats that hold themselves above the law, and what are you to do when you see an injustice? There's nothing that you can do in terms of an individual. You could try to take it to court, but we've seen there just seems to be a lot of corruption in terms of the accountability that people such as the media, public schools, or that even such things as Facebook. You say the wrong thing, you get censored. Let's see here. I'll kind of read maybe the last page here, and I thought it was a good ending. Let's see here. It says here that he will never see the light of sun unless I give his eyes an oblique direction. He will never be upright unless I bend his legs. He will not be able to think unless I press his brain. Stop, said the traveler. Whatever God does is well done. Do not pretend to know more than he is, and he has given organs to this frail creature. Allow organs to develop themselves instead of trying to tamper with them, to strengthen themselves by exercise, the use, experience, and liberty. See, God has implanted in mankind also all that is necessary to enable it to accomplish its destinies. There is a providential social psychology as well as a providential human physiology. The social organs are constituted so as to enable them to develop harmoniously in the grand air of liberty. Away then with quacks and organizers. Away with their rings and their chains and their hooks and their pincers. Away with their artificial methods. Away with their social laboratories, their governmental whims, their centralization, their tariffs, their universities, their state religions, their inflationary or monopolizing banks, their limitations, their restrictions, their moralizations, and their equalization of taxation. And now, after having vainly inflicted upon the social body so many systems, let them end where they ought to have begun. Reject all systems and try liberty. Liberty, which is an act of faith in God and His work. So basically what he was saying, that, kind of compressing in a nutshell, he had this opposite belief of what many of his contemporaries had. They had this idea that society of individuals, that societies had a passive level of participation. And if I could relate that with anything, would be the NPC, the non-playable character. If you've ever seen it in a video game, they don't play much of a role. They just have one or two things to say, and that's about it. Whereas legislators and organizers of economies and governments, they believe the same type of thing. They believe that individuals don't have voice. We have to treat them like sheep. We have to herd them into what they're doing. They really can't think for themselves, and we have to tell them how to think. We need laws to guide them, and we need to essentially get them to behave and just to not speak out. Whereas Bastiat believed that individuals, they have an active participation in society. An individual, like he says at the very end of his book here, the very last line, that liberty is to believe God and His work. That you have the faith to do what God has called and commanded you to do, and basically the right to be left alone. So basically speaking, if I could compress it into a basic statement of what his book is about, is that governments left alone will continue to justify the use of legal plunder through tariffs, through taxation. We're seeing it right now through stimulus, through the weakening of our dollar by creating inflation and taking away the purchasing power of your dollar. Basically, all those forms of legal plunder, those things will continue to grow. And I'm going to explain a little bit about how that kind of develops into public schooling and how it affects us directly. Before that, very brief history of public schooling, especially kind of how it affected Bastiat in the 1850s and before then. What pioneered the public school that we're in? Basically, if you want to think about it, public school was nothing more than a design to try to teach young children and young adults to how to become good factory workers. And we're seeing that that's still true today. It teaches them how to have a job. And even more than that, it can even train people in inner cities to get ready for prison. There's something as such as the school to prison pipeline. It's this idea that the school actually looks like a jail, a prison, to get people ready for the idea of the structure of what prison's like, and just the fact that the two institutions are becoming more and more alike, using the same type of organizational structures just to keep people compliant. So what pioneered this? Once again, it's the Prussian System that actually took place in the 18th century, and I'll kind of explain a little bit of what that means. The Prussian System, after its modest beginnings, succeeded in reaching compulsory attendance, specific training for teachers, national testing for students, both male and female, prescribed national curriculum for each grade, and mandatory kindergarten. Training of teachers was increasingly organized, sometimes private. They already had, in 1748, founded the first Lehrerseminar, but the density and impact of the seminary system improving significantly until the end of the 18th century. Prussia introduced state certification requirements for teachers, raised the standards of teaching. They introduced and implemented secondary schools around 1812, extending all of Germany in 1871, and prerequisite of learning professions and higher echelons of civil service. State-controlled remained in place in modern Germany. Prussian system held, at least by the 1830s, characteristics such as free primary schooling for the least and poor citizens, professional teachers trained specialized in college, basic salary for teachers, extended school years for better involved children of farmers, funding of public schools, supervision of national and classroom levels to ensure quality of instruction, secular instruction, and a strong national identity involving science and technology. So a lot of that is things that we see now: national testing, common core curriculum, funding ad nauseum. And so we see in the U.S., however, though, pre-emergence of 1830, there was private and local affairs. Basically, in school, it was more of a private thing. It was a local thing. The Catholics and Protestants kind of held the monopoly in those areas. There were other schools as well, and they all had competition for their pupils. Where it started to lead to an issue is where the federal government started issuing grants and public funds to help them, and basically was awarding a level of protectionism that was meant to put their competition out of business. Just like anything else, it was a business. We see that in the writings of this book. I couldn't find the numbers for 1850, but in 1865 there was 28 million francs a year spent on public schooling, and I use the French model because that's what Bastiat had wrote about. Was basically what was going on in France. So if you take a look at what was happening in the world before 1850, it was basically very ripe, internationally speaking, the revolution of politics, and with that, the revolutions of schools changing from a home church local level into something that was becoming more nationalized. So, how does this relate to the monies being spent and how money and the Department of Education, it's not about the education of the student. It's just not. It is a leviathan, and once again, it needs to be decapitated. But in 2020, the average of per pupil spending by state in 2020, the award for the highest goes to New York. $23,091 per student. Once again, $23,091 per student. Chicago, being the city with the highest expenditures, was $21,962 per student. And this upcoming year, they're proposing an $8.4 billion budget for 2021, with an estimated 356,000 in enrollment of students. And right now, the schools, they're completely closed down. They're only teaching remotely, and the unions themselves are completely defying policy in which the Chicago Public Schools administration allowed for a reopening. So they're still not open. They're still doing remote learning, and it's costing over $21,000, almost $22,000 a year for students to do that alone, to do a Zoom meeting. Utah got the least with $7,100 per student. Minnesota ranks 17th with $12,647 per student. Alaska is 5th with $17,838. So I'm surprised that Alaska actually ranked 5th in terms of public dollars being spent. Over almost $18,000 per student in Alaska. West Virginia reached the median at 25 with $11,000. So it's about $11,500 per year. Which was interesting is that St. Paul, Minnesota ranked 2nd under Long Beach in the least efficient education spending in terms of how it ranks with standardized standardized test comparing to their spending. So it's not looking good. They ranked at I believe the first quarter alone, it only in terms of testing at a 39%. 39% in the amount of answers they got right. They only scored 39% on average, St. Paul, Minnesota, in terms of the dollars being spent. So it's not working, and we all know that it's not working. Over the last year, though, we also see that there have been changes in trends over where families are choosing to opt out of this. So education savings accounts went up 5% in 2020. Tax credit scholarships went up 9%. Private school vouchers went up 16%, and charter schools enrollments went up 13%. As of right now, there are 14 states that allow vouchers to be used to take education funds to a private school. If you don't know what a voucher is, it just basically says that any type of funding, in this case $12,000 awarded to your child to attend public school, you can take those funds and enroll them into a private school or a charter school. But right now, there are no options in Minnesota, in Alaska, South Dakota, North Dakota, that allow for this. I believe that there is in Wisconsin that is an allowable type of thing. If you want to take public funds that are earmarked to your child's education, you can have that voucher put to a private school. So Minnesota does not have that option. They don't have an option for getting vouchers approved for private schools, charter schools, or home schools, but there are tax breaks. In Minnesota, they have a K through 12 education subtraction and credit. Subtraction works like an expense deduction. It's worth up to $1,625 per qualifying child in grades K through 6 and $2,500 for qualifying child's grades 7 through 12. Credit, on the other hand, it reduces your taxes owed, limited at a 75% of your expenses, and there is an income cap. So basically, it is a non-refundable credit. It just lowers the amount. It doesn't, put more money toward a refund. It just reduces your overall amount of taxes owed. So there was, however, talk that never got passed. Trump and Betsy DeVos had talks of introducing the House Resolution Bill 610, which was the Choices in Education Act of 2017. Basically, what it did is it proposed $12,000 in credits available for students and families earning less than $20,000. The bill died in a committee, so I'm not sure. You'd have to be in a tight spot if you can't get $20,000. I'm sure there are people impoverished, but earning less than $20,000. I mean, basically, you got one parent working at McDonald's part-time, and you're trying to raise a family. But they were talking about if that were the case, you could get $12,000 to homeschool your kids, which I don't understand how you're going to do that unless you're a married couple, one's working, making minimum wage, and the other parent's staying at home homeschooling. Which, in my understanding, you'd have to be a pretty qualified individual not working to be able to take that $12,000 and while you're not working and make that stretch in order to have your family's food be put on the table and providing a top quality level of education. But once again, the bill died in committee. But basically, I say all this to start a conversation about just to kind of stretch your imagination. Can you imagine what it would be like if the state had allowed for the $12,500 in funds to go in your pocket, to have it follow the student, or for it to follow them toward their enrollment into a private school? So let's talk about private school. Let's talk about in Minnesota. Most of my people that I know are in Minnesota. There's where I lived in Alaska. There's not a lot of options in rural Alaska. I know Nick Choate was a good private school, but it only was basically a preschool. Had that thing developed into a K through 12, I could see that going somewhere else. But the closest school that I saw with a $11,500 tuition, close enough to having all those funds transfer over, would be Legacy Christian Academy in Andover, Minnesota. It has once again tuition of $11,500. The average private school tuition in Minnesota is $4,300 for elementary age school kids, and just almost $12,000 for high school. So the average private school in Minnesota is almost $12,000. That would be enough to cover it. Basically, you could take the same funds, put them into a private school where they're earning better marks, they have better classroom to ratio teacher size, and it's just an overall better environment for the children. Better yet, there's online options. Maybe your kids are already doing Zoom classes, all remote learning, or a hybrid model, and it's just not working. There's just something about it. They're not paying attention. There's just something about it not working, but yet you still accommodated your schedule to fit for it. You could have them completely opt into an online program. One program that I do like is called Alpha Omega Academy. It is about $1,600 for kids in grades 1 through 5. It's almost $2,000 for kids 6th through 8th grade, and it's about $2,400 a year for kids 9 through 12th grade. Once again, the education credits do not roll over. There's no voucher system in Minnesota, but if that were an option, let's say you're in Wisconsin and you can have that voucher program, basically what it means is that you could use those funds to have your children do their online schooling in maybe a system that's less volatile to their learning goals. Let's stretch the idea for a second of what a micro school is. Let's say for a second that you wanted to start a micro school. What is a micro school? Let's say that you want to have 10 students, and let's say that you have a shed, a giant pole barn, or a giant garage, a heated garage, that you wanted to turn into a classroom, and you put the money into it, and you started your own micro school, and you have 10 students there. basically, and they're just local students in the neighborhood. Or they go to your church and you talk to everybody, and you're all on page that you're the teacher. You're the one that's going to facilitate this. And let's say you have a teaching license or you have a background and you're just an educated person, and you're saying, I want to teach 10 students. Basically, what you could be able to do in terms of a micro school, if you had 100% of all those education dollars going to your micro school for 10 students, your income in Minnesota would be $126,000 a year. And if we're in Alaska, $178,000 in Alaska. That's a lot. And basically what you could do with those funds is you could hire your own overhead. You could hire your own adjunct teachers. You could hire your own administrative staff with that. You could have a take-home pay of $70,000, and you could easily have $100,000 left over in the state of Alaska if that was something that was allowed. But what the problem is that teachers' unions in the Department of Education, they do not allow for these vouchers in many states. Like I said, 14 states are the only ones that allow a voucher system. And why is that? When there are many individuals, let's say you could have a teacher and they are making maybe $30,000 a year in Minnesota, and they're going through the issues that they faced in 2020. They're not allowed to meet with their classroom. Why can't they take their own micro school for a year or two while the COVID stuff is at its heightened point, and it is, and they can assure teachers that they're going to do their own online curriculum through Udemy or through Moodle, and they do something themselves that's completely a part of the Department of Education. They do something private. That teacher, if that's someone in the public school that you love, let's say little Sally and little Billy in your third grade, they love Mr. Smith, okay? They love him. And you want to make them your teacher, but they're going through the issues that they're seeing in 2020 and 2021. Why couldn't the Department of Education use these voucher systems to pay Mr. Smith $126,000 for doing the work that he's doing? It's very possible, but there's so much overhead. There are buildings that need to be paid for. There is insurance that needs to be paid for. And there's all sorts of wasteful spending that happens in the public schools. When I was in college, I took a statistics course. I don't even think that I could understand the professor at all. I believe that he was Russian, and he had not lived in Minnesota very long. And basically what happened is that I needed to use an online type of supplement to help me learn statistics if I was going to pass this class. What I did find was that over on YouTube there was something called Khan Academy, Khan. I'm sure you probably heard of it, Khan Academy. They had little micro lessons they used to teach lessons in statistics and every other area that you could find under the sun. It costed me $0. But what are your children? They're going through Zoom online school, and they're spending $12,000 a year of not your money, but basically it is collectively our money through Department of Education funds. So let's see here. You could do online school that is 10 times less expensive than what the Zoom schools are doing. Yes, there are education that you could pay throughout the whole year out of pocket funds that's less expensive than what they're leveraging over the American citizen in terms of their debt, and it's 10 times less expensive. The amount of wasteful spending is unimaginable, but I do wonder if that level of what Bastiat imagined when he knew that plunder via public schooling would be an issue. That's just one area of society. There is military spending. There are the hospitals that we see. There is the prison systems. There's all sorts of waste, fraud, and abuse. Like we just saw all the pork inside the stimulus bill. There's no reason why we need to be teaching gender studies over in Pakistan when we have homeless veterans here in America. I don't believe in the spending at all. I don't believe in the plunder at all. I want to stick to a politically philosophical sound argument that Bastiat makes of what the law should be, that we shouldn't be in the business of any type of legal plunder whatsoever, and let the private sectors take care of that. But basically here today, as we start to wrap things up, what are we doing here? What are we doing at the Academia podcast? And I wanted to say to you that we are starting a conversation. We basically want to educate about the processes here today, about the voucher laws in the states, and we'll be kind of going over more of that. Maybe you are listening and you are in a state where that is allowed. I know that all the 14 states that do have them, including DC, they have specific differences between them. Most of the listeners that I have right now are in Minnesota or in Alaska, and it does not apply to them. I wanted to also educate about how we can deliver a top quality educational curriculum for your children. Like I said, I'm going to be teaching Talissa homeschool this year, and we have a lot of goals and we have a lot of dreams and vision, and we're not at the place where we want to disclose what all of those are. We're kind of trying to see things develop as they come out. The more we kind of put our hands to the plow and see things take shape. But one thing that I do want to offer moving along the line is a resource to help you deliver your own educational curriculum to your own children, if that's something that you want to do. Maybe if you want to opt out of online schooling altogether, or public schooling, or even private schooling, and you want to do it your own, you just kind of want to maintain that level of control over the education of your child. We want to be part of that conversation. I want us to begin the process of opting out. How do we opt out? Why would we want to opt out? And I'll kind of explain some of that here. Basically, in terms of money, you could be able, if you were to finance it yourself without the voucher system, if you wanted to send your K through 6 student, the average private school in Minnesota is $4,300, or it would be about $360 a month in terms of extra money. So basically, there are things that you could do in terms of personal finance to get to that spot. You could try to do things where you're earning $180 extra a month and where you're cutting spending $180 a month. And that would allow your child to go to a private school. Or you could do an all online school in Minnesota, K through 6. There's the example that I did give. The price of that would be about $1,600, or about $135 a month. If someone told me that I had to increase $135 extra a month, I think I could possibly find ways how to do that, to either make that money extra or cut enough spending to make that happen. And then for high school age students and middle school, that was going to be about $12,000 roughly for private school for tuition, or roughly $1,000 a month. Online school is going to be for them about $2,400, or about $200 a month. So generally speaking, providing for it out of pocket would not be the end of the world. It certainly is doable. I know a lot of you are thinking of the ideas of, well, you have more than one student, or I have a high school age student. Maybe I got 3. It's not realistic for me to have $3,000 extra a month to be able to do this. But I understand that might be a hardship for some of you, but I want to have the conversation of why it's important to the idea of opting out. Private school could be an option if you absolutely depend on the school to also provide childcare. There's another sort of thing. Let's say, though, that you wanted to make online schools work for your child. If you could provide an online school. You and your significant other could work opposite ends of the schedule, working different shifts. I know it's something that Emma and I do now, so we don't have to have our children in child care. I work first shift every day till about 2 p.m. I have it flexible with my employers, and I do work a little late on one day a week on Emma's day off. And then as well, Emma works in the evenings. We do this so we don't have to have our children in daycare. We've decided, we made it a priority and a commitment that we want to make sure that our children are at home with one of us, because we want to be the ones that are going to provide them their schooling. We want them to get used to it already. Basically, though, could you do that? Could you switch to part-time, or have your significant other, or on the side, could you do a side business and allow that to grow over time? Could you do something where you're starting to do a little bit of extra work to develop what a side business would look like on Saturdays, or where you're putting in some extra work on the evenings, or waking up a little bit extra early to grow this thing? I know it might seem like you don't have the time already, but we all do have the time. Is it worth it for your kids? I did see a survey on Facebook today, and basically it was asking people if any of our children are taking these extra added measures in their public schools. Some of these were alarming to me to even consider the idea that some kids have to face these level of anxiety-inducing situations. But I'm going to read the different options that they did allow. Some were all outdoor instruction. I can only imagine an Alaska or Minnesota winter where the instruction was outdoors, unless it was for the purpose of teaching them how to survive in the wilderness. And I do think that using outdoor education is going to be something that is beneficial, but not for the purposes of what they're talking about. Mandatory mask wearing for students, no sharing of books or supplies with other students, students with the same students all day, mandatory mask wearing, daily symptom screening for those going onto campus, having a closed playground, reduced class sizes, use of separators or desk shields in classrooms, a closed cafeteria, restricted entry into school, examples given, no parents or caregivers, no school-based extracurricular activities, including no sports, no clubs, and no after-school care, students with the same teacher all day, extra space between desks in classrooms. You see, I can't imagine having my children go into these types of schools where if they were to play outside, they all have to stand on special dots, or they have to ensure that kids aren't going 6 feet from each other, or having them wear face shields. It's not worth it to me. All I'm letting you know, though, is some of you are okay with having these conversations with your kids to making these types of adaptations, but I'm letting you know it's not going to stop. I do firmly believe that the state and that the educational sector and all of society is gearing up to what they call the Great Reset. Justin Trudeau actually said it by its name. It's not a conspiracy theory. They are gearing up to the UN, United Nations Agenda of 2030 to limit populations and to issue global communism. It is not a conspiracy theory. And it's going to continue to see more and more of these government-instituted mandates until we take a stand. And maybe it gets to the point where we don't overhaul it, and there is no reform, and there is no revolution. But there are certain things that you can do to set yourself up for success, to maintain your personal liberty, especially in terms of how it affects your children. Once again, I'm designing a curriculum for Talissa, and I'll be delivering it for her myself. And I'm doing this because I want to be the pioneer in terms of what it is I choose to do. I've developed curriculums for children in Alaska. I used to work at a group home with children that some of them couldn't read or write, and they were in fifth and sixth grade. And so I had to develop my own individual programs because the school didn't have those available for them. And they still had to go to school under compulsory laws, even though the teachers virtually did nothing to help them. Also, with the amounts of bullying that I've seen in the schools and children talking to me, it's not something that I would feel is absolutely that it's in tandem with the goals that education needs to reach. So I believe that there's an opportunity out there, and there are options out there for you and your children. See, I want to take my daughter further faster. I want her to get from here to there. I want to take her to where no other person can take her, and that includes public education that I believe stifles growth and stifles learning, especially the more I read about development, the more I read about education. In terms of what I learned in public schools, there was a lot of waking up that I had to do, and a lot of things that weren't being taught. So I just wanted to start a conversation here today, and basically speaking, I also just want to thank you. I also want to leave here with a quote of Bastiat that also said that those who hold government-endowed teaching positions would rarely criticize legal plunder lest their government endowments may end. So that's kind of where we leave things here today, is that we know that all public schooling is paid for by the use of public plunder or through taxation. Maybe you're someone that doesn't have kids, or maybe you don't see a direct correlation between how this amount of government spending affects you, but it does. The amount of how much you pay in your property taxes, that increases go up through referendums that are voted on that make the Leviathan even bigger and bigger. And while it may be tempting to get a new swimming center or a public use recreational facility, it always comes with a cost. And I just want to thank you for tuning in here today. Thank you for listening to me to get the conversation rolling. Tuning in next week, we are going to be reading. It's going to be called. I have my bookshelf over there. I'm looking for it right now to see if I can just grab it real quick, but I'm not seeing it. It's called "The Richest Man in Babylon" by George Clason. So basically, that was written in the 1920s. If you want to follow along, I'm sure you can find a free copy online or listen to an audiobook. It's a pretty short book, but it's going to be detailing more issues regarding personal finance, as we kind of talked about today. In order to fund your own private schooling for your kids, it is most likely going to cost some money, whether there's a tax break in it or not. Once again, Minnesota does not have a voucher system, so if you do want to opt out of a public schooling for your kids, it's going to cost some money, and we're going to be going over some personal finance stuff next week that might help you get from here to there. And that's kind of a quote that we have with the group that I started on my own business website. We're going to try to launch, see where that thing goes moving forward, but it's called Warp Zone U, which is short for Warp Zone University. And the quote we have is, from here to there, how do we get you from where it is that you envision yourself to be from where you're at today? Once again, I also just kind of wanted to promote as well my personal website, toddthielen.com. Last name is spelled Thielen. And I also have personal devotions there every single day. Once again, I'll be next podcast will be Wednesday, as we talk about some interesting developments with personal finance and basically using an extended allegory in teaching in terms of how it applies to our lives. So thanks for tuning in again. Bless you guys. Hope have yourselves a wonderful day. God bless.